So my first conscious awareness that there was something called a higher state of consciousness was when I was 18 years old and I had moved away from home to go to university. And I found in a used bookstore, I found Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi. And that book made me realize that for thousands of years, people have been following a systematic path. And the goal of that path is to reach a higher state of consciousness. I can't remember for sure, but I think that Yogananda might have used the words Christ consciousness. Anybody remember from the book? I think he did talk about it. And so from that moment on, it was like my whole life shifted when I read that book. I spent a whole weekend just reading that book. And my priorities in life shifted. And my goal was to attain a higher state of consciousness. I wasn't in the beginning really thinking so much about Christ consciousness, because Christ consciousness is just one way to name it. And in the East, they generally name it differently. But nevertheless, I realized there was a higher state of consciousness, and that was what I really wanted. That was my real goal in life. And so for some years after I read Yogananda's book, I was practicing this transcendental meditation. And I also talked about higher levels of consciousness there. And the first higher level you could reach was called cosmic consciousness. And then there was something in between that I don't remember. And then the highest level was unity consciousness. That was the words used in transcendental meditation. So for those years, I really wasn't thinking much about Christ consciousness. But then in the early 1980s, I found Ascended Master teachings, and they talk a lot about Christ consciousness. In the Summit Lighthouse, it was talked about on a regular basis, and there was a path to personal Christhood that was talked about. So then I started contemplating that terminology, or just using that terminology to contemplate what a higher state of consciousness would mean. But I was, of course, very much like the masters have described during this conference, that I allowed my ego and my outer mind to create definitions of what Christ consciousness was. But I will say, when I think back, I think that ever since I was a child, I had mystical experiences. And they were usually experiences of my mind becoming free of thoughts, and I was just conscious. It wasn't that I was only, conscious without any objects, but I was conscious in a situation. I was just observing the situation neutrally, without thinking as I normally did. And so I always had a sense that a higher state of consciousness meant that you somehow transcended this level of the mind that's always thinking and evaluating and judging and having this value judgment and these fears and these opinions. I realized there was a neutral state of mind that you could achieve, and that is part of Christ consciousness. But I still, of course, had some ego-based idea that, it meant that I would know everything, or I would be able to come up with the ultimate argument, or I would maybe even have certain abilities, like being able to see people's auras or whatever it could be. And so I remember in the culture of the Summit Lighthouse, there was sort of what I could call a idolatrous view of what Christhood meant, that it was sort of an ultimate state of consciousness, and it gave you this knowledge and this ability. And it took me a while to realize that that wasn't actually accurate. And I'm remembering right now that there was a big turning point for me, which came in, it must have been 1988, where I attended this, they had these courses, several, I think there were 3 month courses called Summit University. And I was attending this course, and we had a lecture on the Ascension. And there were certain requirements that were mentioned. You have to balance your karma, fulfill your divine plan and your sacred labor, and probably some others I don't really remember. But these were sort of outer requirements. And as I was sitting there listening to this, I had this experience like I was outside of my body, and I had this intuitive sense that the ascension actually required you to stand there in front of a gate that led to the ascended state. That was how I saw it. And then before you could walk through that gate, you had to take a long look back at Earth. And you couldn't have anything that was unfinished, that pulled you back here, that you wanted to change. You had to be able to look at Earth and just let it go. Then you could walk through the gate and ascend. And that was something that wasn't talked about in the summit. It was almost like the ascension was a little bit of a mechanical process. You fulfill these outer requirements, and then you are suddenly ascended. And Christhood was described a little bit the same way, that you just had to balance your karma, give the decrees. There was not much talk about resolving psychology until a little bit later. And so I had this sense that Christhood isn't a mechanical process. And I'd also come to see that in Transcendental Meditation, it was also portrayed that if you just meditated, then after some time, you would automatically receive or attain the cosmic consciousness. And I realized that just couldn't be the case. And so once I had this experience of the ascension, I started realizing that in order to be able to make that choice to leave Earth behind, you had to resolve whatever it was in your psychology that made you still tied to Earth. At that point, I didn't really think about attachments, but that came later. And so I realized that a big part of Christ consciousness is really to resolve your psychology so you are free, that there's nothing that pulls you back to Earth. And I was very fascinated by this quote from Jesus that the prince of this world cometh and has nothing in me. And I realized this was part of attaining Christhood. And then some years later, I became fascinated by this story about the Buddha sitting under the tree, ready to go into nirvana, but he had to face his last test, that the demons of Maya were allowed to tempt him into reacting. And I intuitively sensed that they were simply trying to get him to react to anything on Earth, so he wasn't free to make that choice to leave the Earth behind permanently. And so that made me understand Christhood at a deeper level, where instead of thinking, as it was portrayed in the summit, that I was acquiring all this knowledge and ability so I could do something that other people couldn't do, I started realizing that it is really about freeing myself from these attachments to Earth so that I can leave the Earth behind. And also, when I had that experience about the ascension, I realized that the ascension is a completely final step. I mean, once you ascend, you can't just sit up there in the ascendant realm and say, oh, I didn't fix that down on Earth. I'm just going to pop down there and fix this. Once you are gone, you are completely gone from Earth. It's final, it's absolute, there's no way back. And in order to make that decision, you cannot have anything unfinished here. So this became my goal, to reach that state of non-attachment. But then there came a point where I started realizing that in my upbringing in Denmark, I was influenced by this idea that's very prevalent in Danish society, that you don't think you are better than others. That's almost like the worst thing you can do in Denmark is to think you're better than others, which is very different from the United States, where most people want to be better than others. But so I realized that, and also from past lives, I think I've been in these spiritual traditions where it's seen that pride is a major obstacle on the spiritual path. And so I had it very deeply in my mind that I couldn't be prideful. And I interpreted that to mean that I couldn't really allow myself to think that I had any attainment beyond other people. But there came a point where I suddenly had this experience. It was like something in my mind was saying, do I believe that the teachings of the Ascended Masters work? Do I believe that the decrees work? And then I had to recognize that I had practiced the decrees for a number of years. I had studied the teachings. I had done what the master started saying in the early 1990s, work on resolving my psychology. So if I believed that the teachings worked, then having practiced them for so many years, I should have made some progress. So if I wasn't acknowledging that progress, I was in a sense denying that progress. And so I had to decide, if I believe the teachings work, then I need to acknowledge that I made progress. If I don't believe they work, then I should just stop. Because what's the point in doing something if you don't believe it works? And so since I believed that it worked, I had to acknowledge I have actually made some progress. And that was where I started daring to acknowledge that I had attained some level, the beginning levels of Christhood. And it was important for me to recognize that, because it meant that I could start working more consciously on it, instead of thinking, it's just a byproduct of decreeing and studying teachings and resolving psychology. And you can say that if you resolve the psychology, give the decrees, and study teachings, you will make progress towards Christhood. But you can actually make more progress by being conscious of Christhood being your goal, and what does it take to attain it. And so I started working more on this. And that's when I really started looking at this idea of the attachments and having these attachments. And then, of course, it was also important for me that at some point in the early 1990s, I realized that in the Summit Lighthouse, Mother Mary had given some dictations about surrender and the importance of surrender. And I started really contemplating the importance of surrender. And of course, it tied in with this idea of the Buddha achieving non-attachment. Because how do you achieve non-attachment? Well, there are certain things you just have to give up. You just have to surrender. And so that helped me look at myself and look at my path. And in the late 1990s, I was really thinking about my entire approach to the spiritual path. Because in the beginning, I was very eager to do all the outer things right, so I could seem like a good student. And it was really my ego that wanted to be seen as a good student on the spiritual path by doing all the outer things. And I started realizing more and more that that wasn't the highest motivation. So I went through this process of looking at why I was on the spiritual path and what was my motivation. And was it really to achieve any outer abilities or knowledge or anything like that? And I gradually refined it to where really my goal was to attain this higher state of consciousness where I didn't have any attachments because I was neutral. And I realized that there was really none of this outer stuff, these outer desires to be special or to have a special ability, that I wasn't willing to give up in order to attain that higher state of consciousness. So then I moved away from the Summit Lighthouse after Elizabeth Clare Prophet retired. And I had some years where I was still doing the degrees and studying teachings, but I was mostly processing my entire experience in the Summit. I had lived in Montana, where the Summit Lighthouse headquarters was, for 10 years. I had participated in all of these conferences. I had heard over 300 dictations live given by Elizabeth. And so I felt like being away from it gave me an opportunity to process and integrate the teachings. And then there came that point that I've talked about before, where I was just sitting in my office having decreed. There's also my decree room where I had pictures of the masters at that time. And I suddenly had that vision where I saw how a lot of the motivation for being such an ego student on the spiritual path had been ego-based. The ego wanted to seem special. And I just saw the vanity of the whole thing. And when I saw it, I didn't have the concept back then. But what happened was that my conscious you separated itself from this subconscious selves that had this ego-based motivation. And I just saw them from the outside. I saw the vanity of it. And I just spontaneously, when I saw it, I just let it go. I felt this tremendous release that it all just, I surrendered it all. And I felt such a sense of peace. And the words that came to me from deep inside my mind was, God, you can take me home right now. And some people I've told this story have felt kind of offended by it. They thought that was crazy. But it was really just this sense that all of my human ambitions for what I wanted to achieve in this life and what I wanted to achieve on earth and what I wanted to achieve on the spiritual path, I had just surrendered them all. So if I had died at that moment, I would have been at peace with leaving the earth behind. I wouldn't feel there was anything I had to do here, anything that was unfinished. And so after I had said this, that's when I felt Jesus's presence with me in the room. Not that I saw him physically, but I very strongly felt his presence. And that's when he said, well, if there isn't anything you personally want to do on earth, are you willing to do something for me? And then again, from deep within my being came, yes, I'm willing. And so what I'm trying to say with this is that I really feel that that kind of a surrender of your human ambitions is really a turning point on the path to Christhood. It wasn't that I was approaching Christhood before. I was gradually growing towards it, expanding my understanding, healing psychology, dissolving karma and energy. But this was a major turning point, because it was actually where I manifested at least some degree of Christhood by that total surrender. And you can say, how is that relevant for you? Because you can't force this kind of surrender. In other words, you can't go home with the outer mind and say, I'm now going to surrender my ego. It can't be done. You can't force it. But I wasn't forcing it. In fact, I wasn't even thinking about it. But I was gradually building up to it by being willing to look at my motivation for walking the spiritual path, like the masters have been talking about. And so you can't force the surrender, but you can prepare yourself for it. You can set the foundation for it to happen. And this is what I had done in those at least 10, 12 years before it happened. And then, of course, after that happened, what happened was that I had a clear vision of my divine plan, which for me involved working directly with the masters and being trained to be a messenger and take these teachings. Now, for you, your plan is different. But when you have this total surrender of the outer ambition, you will also have a much clearer vision of your divine plan, whatever it is for you individually. And that's why I think that you can all replicate that process of working towards that surrender, experiencing the surrender, and then having a clear vision of what you are really here to do as your gift. But it's very clear to me, and it was very clear to me back then, that this didn't mean that I was now the fullness of Christ consciousness, that I had the fullness of Christ consciousness. It was very obvious to me that there was more to achieve. There was still more psychology that I hadn't resolved. And ever since then, I have been going through this process of looking at my psychology and going to deeper and deeper layers of it. And especially in 2017, when we started getting these teachings on avatars, unnatural planet, birth trauma, primal self, that really was another major turning point for me, because I really felt that I took my past to a higher level, and I really started resolving these deep psychological issues. I do want to say here, just as a side note, that in those many years in between, I was still, of course, making progress towards Christhood. And one of the things I faced during those years was these certain outer challenges where, for example, I was sometimes accused by people of various things, including an ex-wife, and I had to consciously decide to turn the other cheek, to not react to it, not respond to it, not to try to defend myself, not to prove myself wrong. So this was very important in those years, that I just I made a conscious decision not to react to people in certain situations. And what then happened after I got these teachings on the avatars is that I started, of course, using the teachings, working with it, looking at my psychology. And since then, I have had a number of these releases of certain things. And the first one that I remember was some months after we got these first teachings, and I've been working with them. The dictations have been transcribed. I've been editing them. And I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was awake, but it was almost like my body was still asleep, but I was wide awake. And the words that came to me, there is nothing I have to do on earth. And before that, you could say in 2002, I had this release of my personal ambitions, as I saw it at the time. But then I started working with the masters, and I wanted to be a good messenger. I wanted to bring forth all the teachings they wanted to bring forth. And I realized how many teachings they have and how little time I had and how difficult that was. So I guess I had developed a certain attachment to doing all the work I could possibly do while I was in embodiment. And this then went back to my first lifetime on Earth, and probably even to coming to Earth, where I came here because I wanted to make a difference on Earth. I wanted to see a positive difference of being here. And this I hadn't connected to in 2002, but I connected to it, and then we got these teachings. And so this sense that there's nothing I have to do on Earth was a huge release, because up until then, without being consciously aware of it, I had this sense that there is something I have to do. I can't just leave. But this was at a deeper level that I couldn't see in 2002. So that's why I felt that release at the time. So this went all the way back to even before coming to Earth. And so it was a really big relief to feel I don't have to do anything. That means I can consider, what do I want to do on Earth? And this is also an element of Christhood, because in the Summit Lighthouse, it was almost presented in such a way that the entire spiritual path, growing on the path, serving the masters, it was more like an obligation. It was something you had to do, not only to make your ascension, but you had to do it for the masters. Like they were wanting you to do this. And I realized that this again wasn't the highest view, because of course the masters respect our free will. And so when I released this, it was another big step up. And since then, I've had several of these experiences where I released some of these very deep things, including looking at why I wanted to come to Earth and what I thought I could do or not do on Earth. And what happened as a result of this, working on the birth trauma, working on these subconscious selves, was that I started becoming conscious of how self-conscious I was. The masters talk about this focus on self. Now, you can have the focus on self that the fallen beings have, where they're trying to elevate the separate self, but that wasn't my issue. My issue was more that I was very focused on how other people saw me. And part of it was this, that I felt that I had decided to come to Earth in order to help people overcome suffering. So if they wouldn't listen to me, how could I help them? And therefore, I had to be conscious of how other people saw me, how other people affected me, were affected by me, so that I didn't scare them. I didn't close their minds to me. I didn't cause them to reject me because I was too eager or too forceful or whatever. So I had this very deep tendency to always look at myself and look at other people's reactions. And it was like, I felt like there was somebody always watching every move and every thought and every feeling I had. And there was something commenting on it in my own mind. Some psychologists call it the inner critic. So of course, just the subconscious self. But it was very strong in me. And it took me probably a couple of years to work on it. But finally, I think a couple of years ago, I again had one of these experiences where I just felt that release, that I don't have to be concerned about other people's reactions. I don't have to always watch myself. I don't have to be afraid of making a mistake. I can actually allow myself to be who I am in a given situation. I can allow myself to make a mistake and not be perfect, because that isn't what matters. All these outer details or other people's opinions, that isn't really what matters. What matters is to be an open door for the Christ light. And in order to be that, you have to be neutral. And when I was always evaluating myself, I wasn't completely neutral. And so to me, as I see it so far, this is the higher levels of Christhood. There may be levels I don't see yet, but this is the highest level I've seen so far, that you come to this point where you've overcome this self-consciousness, this always evaluating yourself, looking at yourself, criticizing yourself. It just falls away when these selves die. And therefore, I can today, I'm just much more at peace, much more relaxed, much more able to just be myself, without judging myself and evaluating and analyzing. And this is a whole new level of freedom. And I think this is, well, as I said, it's the highest level of Christhood I've seen. And it's a tremendous sense of peace. And I realized at some point that I needed to start doing these YouTube videos, partly because I needed to put myself out there and experience people's reactions so that I could see if there were any remnants of this self-awareness. And there was in the beginning. It took me a while to work through this to where I could be non-attached to people's reactions. And so that has actually helped me, putting myself out there. You could say I was out there all along, but this was in a more personal way. So it has really helped me work on these last remnants of this self-consciousness, to where I can just be who I am and allow myself to be who I am, whatever that means at the moment. And I think an important aspect of this is that up until then, when I had that self-consciousness, I still had some sense that being the Christ means you are somehow perfect, according to an outer standard. You never really make mistakes. You never really, there's nothing you really don't know, or you never do anything stupid or whatever. It was like I had in my mind that being the Christ meant you couldn't be human. You couldn't be a human being and be the Christ. And what I realized was that this again was a wrong view. It was not the highest view, because attaining personal Christhood means that you don't have any of these dualistic subconscious selves. But it doesn't mean you don't have any outer personality or human characteristics. So it doesn't mean you're perfect in the sense that you never have any human traits. It was almost like I thought being the Christ means you're no longer a human being. But you're in a physical body. You have an emotional, mental identity body. You have to function in life. You have to interact with other people. And you just do it a certain way. It's not wrong. It's not dualistic. You're not hurting other people. But just like your body has a certain look that doesn't change, your outer personality has a certain trait that doesn't change because you attain Christhood. But I hadn't made peace with that. I hadn't fully realized that. I thought somehow I would become a non-human and have no personality by becoming the Christ. And that was actually stressing me because it seemed like an impossible task. And I actually had a period where I felt like there was actually somebody who asked me, I can see that you've changed. What's happened to you? Who are you? And I said, I'm nobody. Because I had a period where I felt like I was a nobody. I had no outer opinions, no personal opinions or desires. I had no personality. It was like I was really a nobody. But then it took me some time to work through that, and I realized, hey, but that's not Christhood. Christhood is, I am somebody. I am a human being. I have the personality I have. And I'm expressing my Christhood through that. It's not in a dualistic way, in a self-centered way, but it's just like I have a physical body that has a certain look, I have a personality that has certain characteristics. And they don't need to fade away. Because if I did, I would become like a robot, like a machine. And that's not Christhood. And this culminated in this YouTube video I did not very long ago after I was sick, where I started realizing that even my view of the Buddha sitting under the tree being tempted by the demons of Ma, that wasn't complete, because I thought in order to not react to the world, you had to not have any feelings, not have any thoughts, not have any sense of identity. You had to basically become like a Buddha statue instead of the living Buddha. And I saw in that experience that no, the Buddha still has feelings and thoughts and a sense of identity. The Buddha still had an outer personality that he expressed when he taught. So you are still a living being at the same time as you are the living Christ. And then the other thing that has happened here is that while I was still so self-conscious, there was always a sense that there was a certain evaluation in my mind that was just centered around myself and how I looked at myself. So there was still that subconscious self that was evaluating and judging myself. And what has happened after that fell away is that I'm now serving in a more free way than I was before, because I don't need to evaluate myself or evaluate my service. And that means I feel much more at peace, much more relaxed about being who I am. I'm also, I can see, and I can even see it in my YouTube videos, that I become more relaxed. I don't put on a facade. I don't try to hide anything. I'm just speaking very openly and freely. I don't have this sense that I had before, that where I would often go into kind of kidding, making jokes, being a little bit sarcastic. That's sort of faded away. And it's just a relief to be free of that self. So I know it can sound contradictory, and it really, you know, when I was young, I had a black and white view of Christhood. It means this, it doesn't mean that. But as I have risen higher on the path, I see that there are all these enigmas. And there was a long period of time where I was dealing with various of these. It seemed like contradictions, like I said. You have no self-centered motivation, but you still have an outer personality. Seems like a contradiction, but it really isn't when you resolve it. And so it's like you could say, I become free of the ego-based personality, the dualistic personality. But I'm not a no-self. I'm not a robot. I'm still a human being, in the sense that I have a physical body, I have an emotional, mental identity body, and there are certain characteristics there. But these are just things that I use to express myself and to interact with the physical world and other people. It's not something that defines me, that limits me, that ties me. And I have no need to evaluate it. I just am who I am in a particular situation, and that's that. So I know we're out of time, and I don't really know what else. I mean, there's a lot of things I could say, but what I'm hoping you can take away from this is that for me, attaining my present level of consciousness was a long process. And it was not that it was a lot of work and then suddenly there was a breakthrough and now I had the reward. There were rewards all the way along, because so many times I would overcome something in my psychology and I would feel better, feel more free, more relaxed, more at peace. So what I'm saying is, it was a long process. It required a lot of work, a lot of dedication, but it was worth it. And I've always had this sense, ever since I was a child actually, that there's nothing special about me. And the reason why I'm saying this is that means that if I can walk this path to Christhood, you can too, if you're willing to apply yourself as I did. It's not going to happen automatically. It's not going to happen if you're not dedicated. But when I say you're dedicated, it doesn't mean you are overly dedicated as I was in the beginning. You have to find a balance. But if you really are willing to walk that path and look at yourself, there's nothing I've achieved that you can't achieve. And it will be as rewarding for you as it has been for me. Because really, it's been the greatest adventure for me that I could possibly imagine. And part of that adventure has been working with the Ascended Masters, and I think all of you can develop that personal relationship with the Masters, where in the beginning you just get, once in a while, you get an intuitive prompting, but gradually it becomes more clear. And really, for me, yeah, an essential aspect of Christhood. So I need to take a little more time and explain this, because an essential aspect of Christhood is recognizing that your own mind is limited. There are things your own mind can't figure out. And therefore, you need to connect to a mind outside yourself. And that's, of course, the mind of the Ascended Masters. There are other minds in the mental realm and so forth, but really the ultimate connection is your I Am Presence and the Ascended Masters. And so that has been probably the biggest benefit of the entire process, is experiencing the Masters, because that has given me that frame of reference, that there is a state of consciousness that's way beyond what I have, and that is my highest goal, to develop that, to reach that. And I was talking to somebody who said, well, if you hadn't been an embodiment and brought forth these teachings, I don't know what we would have done. And I said, well, I don't know what I would have done if I haven't heard about Ascended Masters and developed a connection with them. Because what would life have been? What would have been the purpose of it all? I knew as a child I couldn't live an ordinary material lifestyle. It just wasn't enough for me. And so what I was always longing for was that connection. And so really the essence of Christhood, you could say, is a connection to a mind that's beyond your own, or to minds beyond your own. And that will come when you overcome the conditions in your own psychology that's blocking the connection. It's not magic. It's not some supernatural ability. It's natural to have that connection. And when you look at what is it in your psychology that's blocking the connection and resolve it, you will have the connection. It doesn't fail. So if you don't feel you have a strong enough connection, it's because there's something in your psychology you haven't seen. That's always been my approach. What is it in me that I haven't seen? And then I look at it and I work on it. And when I release it, surrender it, then I feel a stronger connection. So that's all that came to me for now. So I hope it's been helpful.